Chapter 11. When we awoke in the morning, it was as if last night had never happened. Thorin didn't seem the slightest bit nervous around me, not like how I felt around him. The group went on their own paths throughout Rivendell. I walked beside Bilbo, trying to spend as much time with him as possible before we hit the road again. We started off following most of the company towards a large fountain. To my utter shock, the dwarves started ripping off their clothes and jumping into the fountain's waters. I widened my eyes and tried to avert my gaze. "Is YN shy?" Philly called over to me. "Shut up, Blondie." Boffer snickered from the water and I let out a laugh. I turned back towards the dwarves, keeping my gaze down. There were a few dwarves who had kept their bottoms on, and a few who stood completely naked in the water. I looked towards the partially clothed dwarves and noticed the line of Durans stood among them. Thorin was the only one to keep his shirt on, while the two brothers both stood with their shirts off, puffing out their chest. "Like what you see?" Philly snickered. It was obvious he wasn't talking about himself, as my eyes rested on only one dwarf in the company. Thorin had started to take off his shirt and I looked down at the ground quickly. "I think you have a bit of drool on your chin, YN, Keely laughed, nudging his brother. "Fuck off," I mumbled, glancing back the dwarf lord. He smiled at me in amusement, looking me up and down. Only this time, his gaze was not to size me up. He was just looking at me. I knew my face must have been beet red. He let out a laugh and stepped into the waters, glancing back at me and winking. I nearly fell backwards. My breath caught in my throat and turned around quickly, earning quite a few laughs from the dwarves behind me. They knew what Thorin was trying to do and none seemed upset with it. I grabbed Bilbo's hand and pulled him along. "You like him," Bilbo stated, looking back at the dwarves who were now challenging each other the A game of chicken. "I absolutely do not." I lied. "Please. Did you see the way he looked at you, YN? I don't want to talk about it, let's just walk, huh?" "Whatever you say." We continued through different chambers, marveling at the artifacts the elves had stored. One chamber was more impressive than the rest and both Bilbo and I were blown away. The shards of Narsil rested on the clothes, held up by a carved stone statue. This sword was from a battle I had heard only in rumors. I stood closer to it and looked at the shards. I could see my reflection in the blade and kept my hands in my pockets to stop myself from reaching out and touching it. I looked over at Bilbo, who stood in front of a large painting. Upon closer inspection I could tell it was a painting of the battle. The shards of Narsil were not shards in this painting. Instead we could see the full sword. Bilbo seemed to be very enchanted with the ring around Sauron's finger. The One Ring. I averted my eyes. The thought of the ring made me feel sick. It was made from a place of such hate. "There is a balcony up here. Why don't we go have a look?" I asked, gently pulling his arm. He didn't resist and let himself be taken away from the painting. We walked down a small path and looked up in awe at the houses and buildings around us. Rivendell was extremely beautiful and I just knew it would be hard to leave this place. When we reached the balcony, I sighed in awe. The balcony overlooked the residential area of Rivendell. We could see elves, busy with their lives, children running around. It was amazing. "Not with your companions?" a voice asked from behind us. We turned quickly and I smiled in relief. It was only Lord Elrond. "No, I shan't be missed. YN might be, but the truth is, most of them don't think I should be on this journey," Bilbo told him, not looking at me. "What? That's not true, Bilbo. Everyone is happy to have you here," I reassured him, resting a hand on his arm. "Indeed. I've heard that hobbits are very resilient," Elrond added from where he stood beside me. Bilbo tried to think of a protest but turned up empty-handed and only looked at Elrond with skepticism. "Really?" The elf nodded. "I've also heard they're fond of their comforts of home. I've heard that it is unwise to seek the counsel of elves, For they will answer with yes and no, Bilbo responded. I shook my head at his comment. This was exactly the moment to make sarcastic jokes. Elves loved that. Good one, Bilbo. To my surprise, the elf smiled and let out a small laugh. Bilbo chuckled nervously. Elrond moved around me and stood in front of both of us, looking mainly at my brother. You are always welcome to stay here, if that is your wish. He smiled at the two of us again and walked away, leaving us speechless. Bilbo appeared to be seriously considering the elf's suggestion. Bilbo, you can't be thinking of staying here, I said accusingly. I don't know why, Anne. You clicked with everyone and I just don't feel like the company really cares all that much about me. I care, Bilbo. I want you here. I know you do. He placed a hand on my shoulder and smiled softly. We continued walking through the village and I kept my eye on Bilbo. He was fascinated by the structure, and the more we walked the more I noticed how much he looked like he wanted to stay. I am going to head back to the group, okay? I murmured. He only gave me a small nod. I walked back to the company, looking up at the stars as I did so. It was so beautiful. Stargazing? A voice tasked me. I looked down from the sky and locked eyes with Thorin. He was fully clothed now and I softly smiled at him, looking back up. Mind if I join you? I will require yours and Bilbo's presence for a meeting Gandalf has set up with the Elf Lord, but we have a few minutes to spare. Meeting about what? We can talk about that later. For now let's just enjoy small moments like these. He walked over to me and softly reached down to grab my hand. Will you come with me? He whispered. I nodded and let him take me away. We walked hand in hand towards a mound of grass. He stopped at the top of the mound and sat down, patting the spot next to him. I took the spot beside him and once I was comfortably seated he laid back. I stayed seated and looked at him. He looked so peaceful. I laid down beside him and looked up at the sky. I heard his head turn beside me and when I glanced over, he was looking at me. What are you doing? Memorizing, he whispered, propping himself up on his elbow. I mimicked his movements. You make me nervous in ways I can't explain, he told me, brushing the hair away from my face. Do you trust me? I'm learning to. I smiled at him and he pushed himself up and gave me his hand. I grabbed it and he pulled me up. We stood in front of each other, closer than we had ever been. I looked up into his eyes and he stared down at mine. The world faded away again and the only thing that mattered was him and I, right here, right now. A short cough interrupted us and we both jumped back. It is time, Thorin, Gandalf said, looking between the two of us with a fond smile. Thorin looked back towards me and held out his hand. Will you join us? I nodded and took his hand. He followed Gandalf, who made sure to grab Balin and Bilbo from the company before walking towards Lord Elrond. The dwarf stared at Elrond with disgust. I had let go of his hand now and stood more towards Balin. I didn't want the company to get the wrong idea. It had only been about a month since we left Bag End and I was not looking to start anything serious. The map, Thorin? Gandalf said, nodding at the dwarf. Thorin shook his head, almost taken aback at the wizard's request. It is the legacy of my people, it is mine to protect, as are its secrets. Save me from the stubbornness of dwarves. Your pride will be downfall. You stand here in the presence of one of the few in Middle-earth who can read that map. Show it to Lord Elrond. We turned to look at Thorin, who rolled his eyes and reached into his pocket. Thorin, no. Balin spoke, pulling at Thorin's arm. The dwarf lord shook him off and handed the map to Elrond. Error. What is your interest in this map? Elrond questioned, looking between Thorin and Gandalf. Thorin opened his mouth, most likely ready to fire back a disrespectful remark, but Gandalf cut him off. It's mainly academic. As you know, this sort of artifact sometimes contains hidden text. You still read ancient Dwarvish, do you not?" Elrond nodded and walked towards a beautiful piece of quartz that stood alone in the middle of a circular room. He said something to the wizard in Elvish and Gandalf turned to us. "Moon runes? Of course, an easy thing to miss. Well, in this case, that is true. Moon runes can only be read by the light of a moon the same shape and season as the day on which they were written." "Can you read them?" Thorin asked, stepping in front of the rest of us. "These runes were written on a midsummer's eve by the light of a crescent moon nearly 200 years ago. It would seem you were meant to come to Rivendell. Fate is with you, Thorin Oakenshield. The same moon shines upon us tonight." The elf placed the map on the quartz table, and as the clouds cleared, the moon shone on the map, illuminating the runes. Elrond lifted the paper up and squinted at the writing. "Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole," he read. "Durin's day?" Bilbo asked. "It is the start of the dwarves' new year, when the last moon of autumn and the first sun of winter appear in the sky together," Gandalf told him.
I'm glad you enjoyed that video/gameplay. Just remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. Until next time, goodbye!